Of the 2015-16 One Book, One Northwestern program. The program annually selects a book to the entire Northwestern community to read and then provides programming throughout the school year on the book's themes. One Book is generously supported by Northwestern President Ed Shapiro, chaired by Eugene Lowe of the President's Office, coordinated by Nancy Knitt and staffed by One Book Fellows and Ambassadors. I thank them and this year's One Book sponsors, the Colloquium on Ingenuity and Native American Studies, the Ditmar Gallery, International Program Development, the DIL, Multicultural Student Affairs, and the Native American and Indigenous Students Association. I also want to thank the hard-working One Book Steering Committee that, in partnership with the Mitchell Museum of the American Indian, the D.R.C. McNichol Center of the Library, the American Indian Center of Chicago, the Chicago Humanities Festival, and the Evanston History Center, has put together an ambitious schedule of more than 50 events tied to themes in Thomas King's Inconvenient Indian, a curious account of Native people from North America. The schedule began thanks to Wildcat Rock and the American Indian Center with a night at the Field Museum in Chicago. 2,400 new first-year and transfer students, transported in 55 buses, viewed the museum's Indigenous peoples exhibits and demonstrations of native drumming, dancing, singing, beadwork making, and storytelling. Also, for the first time in One Book's 11 years, it sponsored an essay contest, offering the winner a $500 prize. Every admitted first-year and transfer student was mailed a free copy of King's book this summer and invited to submit an essay of 1,000 words or less on how King's discussion of the identity of Native people made the student think about his or her own identity. 6 volunteers, Jean Herrick, Penny Hirsch, and James O'Loughlin of Weinberg's Cook Family Writing Program, Alicia Wartowski of the Women's Senate, Gene Lowe of the President's Office, and I judged 32 entries. After agonizing over many thought-provoking essays for our students from all Northwestern schools, essays that took us to Colombia, Mexico, India, China, and many other countries, the judges felt 3 students' essays should be recognized as honorable mentions, winners of this year's One Book t-shirt, which I model. The honorable mention winners, who may pick up their t-shirts at One Book's office in Losey Hall, are Weinberg's Ashley Child for her essay Food for Thought, the Bean and Music School's Bradley Fielding for his essay A White Man's Indian Musings, and the School of Communications Alex Jackson for his essay Jekyll and Hyde Question. I believe Alex has a class, but would Ashley and Bradley please stand so that we may congratulate them. And now, drum roll, please. The winner of the $500 first prize and a One Book t-shirt is the McCormick School of Engineering Celestine Emberton for her essay, I Am Malagasy. Celestine, please come up here to receive not your $500 check, but paperwork you need to fill out. It's more than just a long question to mail you your check, which should arrive sometime before you graduate. I guess she's not I will get her check and her t-shirt. Before I introduce Thomas King, I feel as a reader of the Inconvenient Indian that I should introduce Helen Hoy, a questioning character in the book who was, to quote King, sort of over my shoulder for much of my writing. He sees the book as a conversation, not only with himself, but with Hoy, who is his partner of 35 years, a painter, a distinguished fellow professor with King at the University of Guelph's Department of English Literature until they both recently retired, co-editor with him and Cheryl Calver of The Native in Literature, and the author of an amazingly candid article about King The Truth About Thomas, that begins, for Thomas, who will not think better of me for having written this. Ellen White, please stand so that we may recognize you. In introducing Thomas King, I feel obligated to provide a kind of publicist bio that lets you know he is a Renaissance man and one of North America's most important writers. He's a prize-winning novelist, short story writer, children's book writer, detective fiction writer, screenwriter, playwright, poet, anthologizer of writings on many themes, and photographer. He and his 16 books have won virtually every major award Canada has to offer. For example, he won British Columbia's National Award for Canadian Nonfiction for the Inconvenient Indian. Before that, he was awarded the Order of Canada. He created CBC Radio's Dead Dog Cafe Comedy Hour, which helped Canadians learn about the issues of the Native community. He delivered Canada's most significant public lecture series, the Massey Lectures, joining Martin Luther King, John Kenneth Galbraith, and other luminaries. But King has experienced a life beyond the stuff that publicists bias, a life that informs his stories. As a young man, he was a bank teller, ambulance driver, and casino dealer. He worked his way to Australia and New Zealand aboard a steamer. In New Zealand, he worked as a deer culler, beer bottle sorter, freezer packer, and photographer. In Australia, as a house dismantler and truck cleaner. At a mine, he shoveled ore into sacks. In Sydney, he lied his way into a job as a reporter. He filed serious stories, but also stories about drunk teenagers jumping off cliffs into the ocean, and about his driving one of those plastic blow-up dollies around on a date that included dinner and a movie. I'll stop there, except to say that King said he preferred to discuss rather than lecture this afternoon. So this non-native, non-expert will ask him questions and then invite him to tell a story at the end before we get to your questions. But I suspect you will hear more than one story from him. He has a way of turning everything into a story. At one point, he drove to the Southwest to photograph native artists. He brought with him dime store Indian stuff, bad wigs, little bows and arrows, little tomahawks, and Lone Ranger masks. After he did his regular shoots, he would ask the native artists, "Do you have any interest in taking your picture with any of this junk?" The most popular item was the Lone Ranger mask. So we wound up with two photo series, one of serious portraits of native artists, and the other then in Lone Ranger masks. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Thomas King. Yeah.
Is it still hot?
So it's all right, I'll begin at the beginning. You start your book, The Truth About Stories, with stories about growing up in Roseville, California, about your Greek, German, Swiss mother who raised you and your brother by herself, and about your Cherokee father who was often absent and left the family permanently when you were 4. You write, a part of me will be changing these stories as long as I live. How has your early life influenced your career, especially your roles, including the Inconvenient Indian?
Actually, once when I finished writing The Inconvenient Indian, there were two people who read my books. Well, there are more than that, actually, a whole bit. Two in particular. One is my partner, Helen Hoy, and one is my mother. She's 93 now, and she can hardly see. But the book came out in time before her eyesight got to the point where she really needed the big magnifying glasses. And she's always correcting me on what I've done wrong. And so my father left when I was 3, not 4. And yeah, I know. I have to put up with this both from Helen and from my mother constantly, getting the stories rearranged. But much of that much of that early time, I suppose, because I wasn't happy with the situation that I had. I mean, my mother was a single mother in a town at a time when single mothers were not simply single mothers. There were people who had done something wrong. They had lost their man. Even though there were many men that deserved to be lost, nonetheless, the fact that you didn't have one when you should was a problem. So she was not a gay divorcee because they hadn't divorced at that point in time, but the structure of that was the same. So my brother and I held that position in the community of two boys without a father. And for those of you who grew up in the 50s, some of you were here, right? 40s, 50s. It was a kind of stigma, I suppose, that I was missing some part of me, and a very important part if I was a boy, which I was. And firstborn, too. And named after my grandfather, so I was special. For those of you who come from Greek families, you know what that's like. Not to put too fine. I've got to get this story in because I know that there's another native person who was raised by Greeks in the audience tonight. One of the things I had to do when I was 16, I wanted to borrow my grandmother's car. I had to ask her for it in Greek. And we spoke Greek in the household when I was very young, but then my grandfather died when I was 2, and they stopped speaking Greek. And so when I was 16, I lost most of the language. My grandmother insisted that I speak Greek. So I had to learn how to say, and the only problem with it is autokinitomos is a very, very old way of saying car. Most of the contemporary Greeks would say car. And everybody thought this was very cute and very funny, and I got the car. But what I had to do in those early years is I began making up stories for myself, about myself, in my head, for the most part, because we held a kind of marginalized position in the community, which I didn't care much for. I tried to create stories that made me seem better than I really was. And you tell those stories enough and you start to believe them. But of course, then there's always kids around who are going to bring reality back to your door. So very early on, I suppose, I began storytelling. Began trying to create a world out of bits and pieces of the world that I knew. And it was a fairly lonely existence in some ways. And it was a little bit on the depressing side because I understood that I wasn't good enough to be within that society. And so the way in which I could be was to create these stories. And so that's what I did. And once I started doing that, probably I started doing that as soon as I got into secondary school, probably 8th grade, 9th grade. That's the time in which you sort of have to declare your identities and begin with a cubby holding you on campus at high school. I started doing that and I never stopped. I still do that to this day. You can throw me into a strange city. The first thing I think to myself is, what story will I tell about myself this time? Now, I have to be careful because if Helen's with me, but I can't screw around. But if she's not, I mean, I'll fess up. I was in South Shore Lake Tahoe working as a craps dealer. And I had to come back over the top of the hill into the Sacramento Valley to see my mother. And I hitchhiked because I couldn't afford the bus ticket. And some guys picked me up and I pretended that I was a Greek racetrack driver. That happened to be in Salt Lake City. And they got stranded in the arena. And I needed to make my way back. And I took on the accent and everything else. I had enough Greek words, I could sing the Christos Nesty from the Greek Easter service. And so, Cristo Celeste, e a pessoa fala, Zoe, que ele sabe não, ele diz, escreve assim, Zoe, que ele sabe não. Eu go, wow, this guy knows. No reason to do it whatsoever, except for the sheer exuberance, I suppose, of storytelling and hiding in a story. That was the trick, that you could hide in the story and you could be safe. And I think a lot of writers do that. I know that I do that. When I begin to write a book, I look for safe places to be. But of course, there are no safe places to be. And if you're a writer, if you provide yourself with a safe place, you cannot write well. What I tell my writing students all the time, and I suppose it's true of life, is that if you really try to protect your characters, protect yourself, people are going to see that you're not being genuine. That you have to be willing to kill everybody in the place. You start a novel, you have to be able to hurt everybody. At one point, my third novel, which was Truth and Bright Water, I decided I would write a novel about my mother because I wanted to honor her with a book about her life. And she had a hard life. And I thought, this is the way I could do it, is I could write a book. And so I called her up and I said, Mom, my next book, which is called Truth and Bright Water, I'm going to write a book about you. And there was a long pause on the phone. I'll never forget this. I thought I lost the connection. And I said, Mom, you're still there? And she said, yes, I am. And I said, are you worried? And she said, no. She says, because by the time you finish the book, I won't recognize me. And I said, that's not true. That's not true. You will. You'll see yourself, you'll be there, this is going to be an honor thing. And I started writing the book. And as long as I had in mind that major character in the book was my mother, I couldn't do it. Because I could not do what I needed to do to that character. I could not hurt that character. And it drove me crazy. Year after year, I kept trying to write this damn book, and my mother was right there in the way. And I would say, okay, today, you're going to pay for it, Mom. Do it. And so finally, I had to go back and tear it back and say, it's not my mother, it's somebody else. I don't care about this woman whatsoever. If I strangle her in the novel, it means nothing to me, and I finished the novel. It was a pretty good novel. And I said it to my mother, and she said, yeah.
That was the best.
Yeah, that's the last time I did that. So, the storytelling process that probably began when I was very young, all the way through, I've never shut it off. I can't shut it off at this point. I don't know how to shut it off. As you talk to me, if we have a chance to chat, you may see my eyes light up if you tell me something. It means I've just stolen a story. If I need a character who had a rotator cuff injury,
It would be great to see more of you next time.
he winds up with a ligament out of his buttocks. You'll know where that came from. You'll know where that came from. So always on the hunt, beware of me. Always looking for that extra little story, because they're precious. Good stories are precious. Really precious, and I love them.
Well, since we're in a journalism school, I feel obligated to ask you about your brief foray in journalism. Novelist Ernest Hemingway, who wrote for the Kansas City Star and other newspapers, once said newspaper work will not harm a young writer and could help him if he gets out of it in time. Has journalism harmed or helped you as a writer of fiction, and what you call in the case of the Inconvenient Indian narrative history?
Yeah, I have to say that journalism did help me in this way. When I was in New Zealand, I got a job on a tramp steamer out of San Francisco, and I worked my way across one way, so I didn't pay anything for the trip. They didn't pay me anything. They fed me, and I worked on deck. And I got to New Zealand, and through a convoluted process, I lied my way into a job as a photographer. I learned how to do photography. one half day at a time. The idea was that if we didn't learn this part of photography, I'd get fired at the time lunchtime came, and that part after lunch I'd get fired. So I learned photography sort of on the go and with a gun in my head, but I learned it. And then when I got kicked out of New Zealand, which is another story that I've told a couple of times on campus, and I had to go to Australia, after I circled Australia once and got back down to Sydney and tried to decide what I was going to do with my life, because I was basically broke in a foreign country, no backup. And I thought, well, you know, as a photographer, I should be able to get a job in journalism. And because I'm a writer, which I wasn't, but I can tell stories, and so I went into a place called Everybody's Magazine, which was a subsidiary of Australian Consolidated Press. And I said, I'm a photo journalist. Do you have any jobs for me? And they said, you're an American too. And I said, yes, I am. I said, I'm also a Cherokee Indian. They said, oh wow, an Indian and an American. And so the editor was sort of intrigued. He didn't know whether to believe me or not, so he sent me off to do a story about the lifeguards on Bondi Beach in Australia, a big surfing beach there. And I went out there and I got into a surf boat and we got pictures and I talked to the lifeguards and I wrote a story and brought it back to the magazine and they liked it. And so they gave me another story. Some of the stories were pretty god-awful. I mean, Lauren alluded to one of them. In one, I got to take a chimpanzee around Sydney. The chimpanzee was there with the circus. I got to take the chimpanzee around the town, taking pictures of me with the chimpanzee, having coffee with the chimpanzee, espresso with the chimpanzee. And that was one. And the other one that I still haunts me, I suppose, was they got me, I don't know how they did this, they got me to go around with this blow-up dolly, those plastic things, and they dressed her all up, and I went to the pub with her, had beer with her, I went to dinner with her, I took her on to a show, I got on and off these buses, and then I wrote this funny story about, you know, my date with this doll. The worst moment of the whole thing was she spun a leak. And God help me, she spun a leak on the inside side of the thigh. And so we had to take her into a garage, put her down on the floor and patch her. And I just don't know what people thought as they walked by. She was working on this vinyl thing, trying to get her to where she was full air. We were able to do that, as a matter of fact. So those kinds of stories can ruin you. That kind of journalism can ruin you. But what it allowed me to do is to imagine that I actually was a journalist, that I actually was a writer, that I was being paid for my writing, that I was working with other writers. And that kind of stamp, if you will, was really important at the time because people couldn't take that away from me. I could literally say I was a photojournalist, that I was a writer. I wasn't a very good writer, but nonetheless, I was a writer. And so that helped a great deal. And it gave me hope that I might be able to do that.
You said, and I quote, I hate facts because they get in the way of storytelling sometimes. Which reminds me of the advice that Mark Twain said his newspaper editor gave me to cover before. First get the facts, then you can distort them as much as you please. What literary techniques did you bring to bear on the facts? Some quite acoustic facts that make up the Inconvenient Indian, and why did you use those techniques?
Yeah, the techniques that I use in the Inconvenient Indian are not techniques actually that I learned through writing. I learned those through frontline activism during the late 60s, early 70s. I was the counselor for Indian students at the University of Utah, and we got involved in some fairly heavy-duty activist activities. And at that point in time, I decided I wanted to be on the front lines of that. And so they called me up, and I had because because of the times and because of the situations that contemporary Native people found themselves in, if you didn't have some kind of signifiers of Indianness in the 60s and 70s, people might mistake you for an Italian. So most of us would put on a beaded belt buckle, some kind of leather paraphernalia. A headband was always good. A ribbon shirt was, a plus. Leathers were great. Pinto ponies, we didn't have any. And so we would wear this garb around, trying to look as Indian as we possibly could, which simply meant we tried to look the way Hollywood had imagined Indians, and the way North America had imagined Indians. So we had that, and so we played that part. And I went further with it. I get called by TV stations or radio stations or news media, and they would pick a particularly controversial issue, and I would pontificate on that as loudly and noisily and savagely as I possibly as I could. And I remember I was, just before that actually, I was at Chico State University. There's somebody here from Chico State that I ran into.
Larry Stupid.
Yeah.
He's in the back.
Where in the back? There he is, Mr. Chico State. And I was there, and there was a Mohawk guy there, Richard Blazer, Dane, and we started the first Indian organization on that campus. And at one point in time, the campus brought Ruth B.B. Hill. No, sorry, that's another story. Keep my story straight. The campus brought in two guys from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And so it was a panel discussion, myself and Richard, and the two guys from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And, I got up and, beat the podium. I was very good at that. I was about 6'6", 260 pounds, most of it muscle. It was mostly muscle. And then Richard got up and had his say. We were firebrands, we were hot. And, we had the audience just alive on their feet, right on their edge. You could see the fear in their eyes. And then the two BIA guys got up, and they had their pie charts and their graphs and whatnot. They showed how things were much better for natives than they'd ever been before, and we rebuffed them firmly. And when we finished, everybody clapped, and I was feeling pretty good. We walked off the stage, and the woman who had invited us to be there shook the hands of the two guys from the BIA and handed up an envelope. You know the routine. Shake the hand, hand the envelope, shake the hand the envelope. Were you going to do that? I knew what that was, and I turned to Richard, who was coming off the stage behind me, and I said, see that? We came off the stage, and I got a handshake, but no envelope. And Richard got a handshake and no envelope. So we turned around, and I said, look, those guys got a handshake and an envelope. What's in the envelope? And the woman, to her credit, was a bit embarrassed, and she says, well, that was an honorarium. And I says, where's our honorarium? And she says, well, come on, they're the experts. I said, what the hell am I, entertainment? And I realized that's what I was. I was entertainment. I was the angry Indian, the dancing Indian, filled with love, watch it get angry, watch it, shout and beat on the podium. And I thought, I'm not going to be entertainment. And yet, that's a hard thing to get away from, especially with the state that Native America was in at the time. So I did continue that through my years at Utah. But at one point, I discovered that no one was listening. If you were yelling and shouting, if you were, in their face, and for good reason. For good reason, they weren't listening. And so I discovered I had to have a strategy to get past that. And humor was the way in which I discovered. People like to laugh, and while they're laughing, they don't realize how close you're getting. And by the time they stop laughing, and you're right there, you can really reach out and prick them. And I discovered that humor really let me get into difficult conversations and stay there. So as long as there's a little bit of that every so often to take the pressure off. And so I began to try to refine that, try to figure out how much humor is too much or too little, how you make that mix. And I discovered that humor deepens tragedy, and that tragedy sharpens the humor. So if you're talking about a really horrendous issue like residential schools, the effect of residential schools on young Native children, that if you just simply present those gruesome, grueling facts, people turn around. But if you can somehow work in a little bit of humor or look at the idiotic side of it and make people laugh, then they're willing to follow you right into the depths of that story. So that was one thing I learned. That took me a long time to learn, but I've learned it. And, I try to do that with everything when I write. And when I'm working with students who are working with really difficult topics that they're trying to write about, I do suggest that. I say, look to see if you can't find something that you're going to find funny. Normally, when we're thinking about, when we're talking about really horrible issues, the death of a loved one, we cannot bring ourselves to make a little joke or turn it in such a way as you might bring a smile to somebody's face. But I think it's critical and crucial to do that, whether it's in storytelling or whether in real life. I think we have to have that. So that's what I'm trying to do.
Well, Helen has accused you of being an alarmist. Quote, pleased with the partial glass of water, his assessment would be neither that the glass was half full, nor that it was half empty, but that it was radioactive. Despite that, might you tell us whether the glass is half full or half empty for Native people when it comes to major issues you addressed in the Inconvenient Indian, the taking of Native people's land, attacks on their sovereignty and treaty rights, and racism that targets them in everything from movie depictions to their treatment by police?
Okay, so Helen had a conversation with me this afternoon, and she says I need to be more upbeat, and I did not need to be glass half empty for this group tonight because she was worried that I was going to turn people off, but also to suggest that the work that they're doing and the efforts that they're making to change the world, that I would be suggesting that they were for naught. All right, so there's that. One of the things that bothers me greatly, and you'll see it in the Inconvenient Indian, is that I don't know that basic societal and governmental attitudes towards Native people have changed all that much. One of the surprises in writing the Inconvenient Indian was, as I worked my way from the far, far past and worked my way up to the present, I got to around 1985 or so, in through there, 70s, 80s, and I started to look for where things had changed, where policy decisions had changed, attitudes had changed towards Native people, and I realized that they really haven't changed all that much. Things have changed, indeed, but not those deep-seated attitudes. And the way they came out for me was that the issue in North America, when I say North America, I got upbraided by a young Mexican writer for not including Mexico in North America, which I probably should have, but I didn't know enough about it. So it was just U.S. and Canada. Was land, was native land. And the question was, what do whites want? And the answer was, whites want native land. And so native land has been under attack almost from the very beginning. What's happened is the culprits are different now. Before, it could be anything from settlers in particular to government officials, to missionaries, But now it's the corporate world that has come to native land. Right now in Canada, the tribes in British Columbia, bands in British Columbia, are fighting against the Keystone Pipeline, which wants to run the pipeline right through their land. As a matter of fact, they're front line on that. And that idea that Indian land really isn't sovereign Indian land has always been a part of the North American idea about Indians. And that's, for me, and keep in mind I'm 72, and so many of you are much younger who are doing the good work now, so bravo, don't listen to me, I'm just an old monk that does see a glass half full. But it bothers me that I don't see any way to stop that invasion of native land. And once we lose that land base, we lose just about everything. We've been pared back. I can take you through all the land losses, the removals, being shipped out. The Cherokee was shipped out to Georgia in late 1830s, early 1840s into Oklahoma. Every time we get moved, we lose land. We lose control of some part of our homeland. And those homelands are critical to us. They may be reservations, they may be reserves, they may have been stuck on them against our will, but nonetheless they are ours. And it just bothers me a great deal to see that kind of loss that continues. Although, okay, uplift, all right? Okay. Some of the gaming tribes, the tribes that have casinos on their lands, have been using the proceeds of that industry to buy back land. Some of the natives on the East Coast have actually bought large chunks of land, and they've been able to get them declared reservation land under protection of the federal government under treaty. The Cherokee, who really don't have a reservation, but the tribe has been buying up land along the interstates in Oklahoma and putting in drive-by casinos. I just love them. You come off the Clover Leaf, there's this little casino there you can drive up, and run in and drive $20 and run back again. And some of that money is going back. And that land may well be turned into federally recognized land, I don't know. And there was a small tribe down near Glendale, California, that did that very thing, bought up land around the outskirts of Glendale before Glendale could annex it and turn it into reservation land and had the city council copy. You can see the smile on my face. I don't need to tell you how I felt about that. So that's, I suppose if there's any good news in all of that, it's there. But the fight continues, and it is non-stop. That's the problem. And we run out of gas. We have generation after generation that has to fight those fights in court. Most all decisions on Native people are settled in court these days. I can't seem to do it just, I don't know, just common folks. In court. And we've gotten good at being in court. We got a lot of native lawyers. Didn't happen before, now we have. So I don't know how it's going to work out. You'll have to tell me. I'll be dead before I see the end of that. And I suspect that your children won't see the end. I hope things work out well. We'll see.
Well, I have many more questions, but I want the audience to be able to ask, and I promise to tell the story.
Yeah.
So you might tell the story, please?
Yeah, sure. Let me tell you a sad story that has a little bit of humor to it. I don't tell this story often, but I've had a very good time at Northwestern. I really have. Normally, when I come on campus, there's this idea that they want to use me as much as possible. I'm doing 4 or 5 events a day. I just collapse after the second event. Northwestern has been really very civilized and very well organized. I must say, very well organized, so I appreciate that. So, I'll tell you the story of my father. You might enjoy it. My father deserted my mother when I was about 3 years old. My brother would have been just born. Matter of fact, the story we have is that he took my mother to a place called, to a park in South Sacramento and told her he was going to be leaving. And she had my brother in arms. He was only a couple of months old. And I was, standing by her side. And I don't have a picture of that, but I've created one as a photographer. I can see that. And then he took off, and we were left alone. My mother was left to fend for herself, and she didn't have a particularly good education. Smart woman, smart as hell, but nonetheless, not much to fall back on. And she started doing people's hairs in a carpet that we had at this house. And when I was about, I don't know, maybe 9, 10, 11, something like that, my father called home and said he'd like to try things again. And he was back east in Illinois, and could he come home and see if he couldn't work things out? And my mother, who had not divorced him, said, yeah, we could give it a try. She was a romantic. She always thought he'd come back. I mean, this is a woman whose favorite movie is The Sound of Music. I had to take her to see it and sit there as she's singing along. Mom, just teach your mom. Anyway, so she said yes. And he said, I'll be there in 3 days. He never showed. And we never heard another word from him again. She thought he had died. And she wrote the tribe, and she wrote the army, because he'd been in the army. And, he had 2 sisters, and when we lost track of our father, my brother and I, we lost track of the sisters as well. We had no idea where they were. And so when I was about 57, I got a call from my brother, and he said, are you sitting down? And I thought it was about my mother, something that happened to her. And I said, is it Mom? And he said, no. He says, we found our father. And I said, whoa. Now you have to understand that I had built a story all of my young life about finding my father, the son of a bitch. And the story was that I would find out where he was. I'd locate him. He wouldn't know that I had located him. And I'd go over there and he'd be at a bar having a couple of drinks, talking with a cocktail waitress. And I'd come in and sit down at the bar next to him. And I'd engage in a conversation. How you doing? What's your name? And what do you do for a living? Got any kids? And I would talk just long enough to where, because I looked very much like him, to where he would turn around and look at me. And for that moment, think, is that? And I'd get up and leave. He wouldn't say that. I was looking forward to that. I really was. And so my brother said, we found our father. I packed my bags, get that bar seat, start going. How are you going to walk in? What are you going to wear? And then Chris said, yeah, but we found him, he's dead. And I thought, oh, shit. I said, well, how did all this come about? And he said, well, here's what happened. He said, our oldest aunt hadn't seen her brother in years, didn't know if he was still alive. So she was nearing retirement. She hired an old ex-railroad employee who advertised he would find relatives for $50. And so she gave him $50, and he found my father. But she found him just as he died. And so he told my aunt about it. My aunt went out there for the funeral. And lo and behold, my father had been married 2 more times with 2 other families, 7 other kids, who knew about each other. And so at the funeral, the oldest boy, Robert King Jr., stood up and said, as the oldest member of the King family, it falls upon me. And my aunt said, excuse me, what about Tom and Chris? They had never heard of us. Didn't know we existed. My father just sort of left us. That was it. And so that should have been the end of the story. Another sad story. I can see it. Not tears in the eyes. And but one of my half-sisters, a woman named Kelly Witt, decided she was really intrigued by having 2 older brothers, so she hired the same guy. And he found my brother. And my brother found me, and we called the rest of the family. And we had photographs of my father as a very young man. They had photographs of him in middle age and older age. is we all got together, actually in Chicago, at the Ambassador Hotel, and met for the first time, all 9 of us. Now, that was kind of weird. You're meeting 7 strangers who are related to you by blood, and you look at them, try to find some commonality, some link, and there's none. There's none. They are what they were before you met them, strangers still. And that was a great tragedy, because we never knew those people at all. I mean, they could have been family, but now we did get together with a sister who tried to find us. We're still in contact with her. But nonetheless, it's hard to make those family connections when there really wasn't a family to begin with. Bloodlines will do for some things, but family is family, whether they're actually related by blood or not. So that's the story that I don't tell all that often. I don't tell all that often because it makes me sad in the end, for all the humor in it. So,
Thank you so much for telling that story. And we have 10 minutes left for your questions. There's one up in the front row of the balcony. Maybe you could speak up loudly so that, there's a microphone. That's fine. Thank you, Lorenzo.
Hello, my name is Anthony Roy. I'm First Nations Chagini, and it's Northern Ontario. And I want to continue the conversation about decolonizing and the fight that's going to continue for this generation, next generation, who knows. The methods of decolonizing, I've been seeing this is decolonizing. Decolonizing is the no more white tears and this is reverse racism. You're hurting us. Why are you taking this back? This is all taken already. It's more so a return, our return to our ways, right? Do you see this future as something applicable for within this generation, 2 generations? I know it's a long fight, but is it my generation defining the laws of it? Like I'm still on this decolonized boat. It's our education to returning, decolonizing of our lost ways and returning back to what was stolen, what was taken, and started with our children, right? My father was a residential school survivor of about 9 years, and he went to the grave with that kind of repercussion. I went to the Truth and Reconciliation in Ottawa just this past spring, and I was able to tell him the news, and he was just like, it wasn't enough. Yeah, it was not enough. They gave me something, just shut up. So he went to the grave with that. I told him, I'm going to get it, Dad. It's not this generation, I'm going to get it for you, I've done your time, my time. I won't continue the fight. But I feel like this generation is outlining that. What do you feel that this decolonizing movement is?
Yeah, and that continuation has to go on for it to make any gains at all. But one of the things I did discover as I've gotten older, people used to ask me, how do we help Indians? And I never really had a very good answer for that, even though I tried to do it. And I realized that actually the question is the wrong question to ask, because frankly, we don't need any help. We need non-native North America to get out of our way and to stop sticking their nose in our business. And the other part of that is that actually non-native North America needs to heal itself. North America has got itself into this capitalistic model where it's profit at any price, convenience, and what's my other term? Convenience here? Well, comfort, convenience and comfort at any price. Every new thing. Whites are clever as hell. You guys can put. I thought bottled water is the be all and the end all. Nothing we're looking to commodify and sell. Why anybody would bother with bottled water is beyond me. I mean, listen, just for instance, you put the water in the bottle, you put the cap on the bottle, you put the bottle on a pallet, you wrap it all in plastic, you send it to the supermarket, somebody picks up a case of it, brings it home, puts it in the refrigerator. How old is the water at that point? 3, 4 days, 5 days, something like that. You put a glass of water that you've half finished on the windowsill, and you come back to it 20 minutes later. Do you drink it? You pour it out, you pour something with a glass of fresh water. So here you're buying stale water in a plastic bottle. They have perfectly good municipal water. Now, it's convenient. It's easy to get a hold of. It's a new thing. And I thought, okay, that's got to be it. They can't go any further than bottled water. And then you come along with these Tassamon machines, where you take coffee, you dry it, you put it in the pot, you put the pot on a pallet, you wrap it in plastic, you ship it off to the store, you pick it up, you bring it home. If you know anything about coffee, once you grind coffee, it begins immediately to lose its flavor. Immediately. I have an espresso machine at home. I don't grind my beans until I'm going to make a cup of coffee. And so I can't imagine what is inside these little pots. I know what comes out, dark liquid. This wasn't a test, was it? Or,
Watch out, what you say.
It was fresh brewed.
It was fresh.
Anyway, there is this whole societal notion that you have to have the newest and the best, and everything, it gets turned over and thrown away. There's an old story about the Cherokee. Every year when the winter was over, we bring everything out into a big pile, everything out from our lodges, put it in a pile and burn it. And of course, it makes a lot of smoke. And there was a missionary standing next to one of the headmen. And, the fire just starts blazing away. The smoke gets into their eyes. And the missionary is dabbing his eyes and snorting into his handkerchief. And he says, "The trouble with you Indians is you give everything away." And the headman looks and says, "The trouble with you white guys," looking at his handkerchief, "is you keep everything."
Yes, question here. Now wait, can you wait for the microphone because we have people up and down?
It's not exactly a question, but a commentary, and like some.
Well, can you just go to the question so that we only have
Well,
3 minutes
it seems
left?
to me that there's fundamentally difference in philosophy from the white man to the native person, and that is a trust in nature. And that the Western idea, they're wounded and they do not trust nature, but I feel like old ways of thinking trust and honor nature. And that seems like this fundamental.
Yeah, I really don't think there's a fundamental difference, to be honest with you. I think that what's happened is that North America has been sold a bill of goods. I talk to people who are just as concerned about the environment as Native people are. I talk to non-Native people who are just as concerned about the state of affairs on Indian reserves as we are. It's just that it seems to be a societal headlong plunge. I think if it's sold a bill of goods, it'd be nice if you could step away from it. There doesn't seem to be any way to do that. I don't know how to get North America off that train track. But I would say, in part, that's your job. My job is to look after my side of that equation. And that's to do as much as I can for Native people and for Native reserves. But it would be nice if you would heal yourself. If you would look at your own society and say, what is wrong with this? Where is it leading us? What can we do about it? There is too much money. I talk to bankers and I've asked them how much is too much money. People tell me there's no amount of money that's too much money. But it's a lot. There is too much money. I'm happy if I've got coins in my pocket at the end of the month to buy myself a cup of coffee. I don't need the rest of it. And it's a burden, quite frankly, to have that kind of money, those kinds of things that you can buy. Big houses, gated communities, all those things. destroy the fabric of society. We can't keep doing that.
Back in the,
But you get me on my soapbox, watch out. I'll hear from Helen about this.
Actually, that's my question. It's a silly one, but in the first chapter, you talk about how Helen told you not to discuss Columbus first, and then you talked about Columbus.
Yeah.
And later on, she said, Helen said I shouldn't make lists, and then you proceed to make lists. My question is, why don't you listen to your wife?
Why don't I listen to my wife? I do, actually. I try, because she is my monitor. You know, these are my stage performances. You have to understand that, even if it looks like it's off the top of my head. There is a performance mode that I get into whenever I go on the road. It's just a natural thing. I can't help it. And so she always critiques my performance after I'm done. And let me tell you, no matter what you say to me, no matter how much you hate what I said, or how much you think I was wrong, it's nothing when I get from her. You'll go home to the bed and breakfast. The first thing I will do is turn on the TV and turn the volume up. The first thing she will do is say, Tom, you know, could you turn the volume down? No, I'll turn the volume up. And I'll get the critique on that. So I do listen to her. Sometimes I get a little bit really angry, and I have to rein that in because it's counterproductive in the end for the kinds of things that I try to do. So she helps rein me in on that. And she also gets me to talk about tough stuff that I don't want to talk about.
I'm sorry. A last question. Back here, I can't see who it is. Yes, please.
Hi, I wanted to ask you a question actually about your prologue also in the book, where you talk about the things that you're not going to talk about, including the Painted murders, which I'm from that area, British Columbia, so I was a bit shocked. What do you mean you're not going to talk about that? But actually I became very curious as I went through how what kinds of things you were going to talk about and what audiences you were imagining speaking to when you were constructing your book, which I appreciated more and more the fact that painting wasn't there as I went through, but was just curious about that process.
Yeah, there's lots of ways in which I could have written this book. I could have done it as a chronological history, you know, from point A to point B. I could have written it as a case study history, you know, A, B, C, D, E, and just line them up like little prisoners against the wall, shot down each one. But what I wanted to do was to create a kind of rolling narrative that moved forward and moved backwards at the same time, that tried to capture how, I don't want to say the feeling of, I wanted to capture this arc that is the backbone of data history in North America. And so in some cases it meant, and I had a limited amount of space, so it was a matter of what do I talk about, what don't I talk about? How do I craft it in a way that makes sense as a complete whole? And that was very hard because leaving some of that behind was difficult. But some of those issues that you raised, for instance, the missing murder, missing Aboriginal women, was a much larger issue that I could handle in the book, and I did not feel comfortable just sort of mentioning it in a part of a chapter and then walking away. And I hope, quite frankly, that someone else would do a book on that, and I think they might. But I think that was much too important an issue to put into a book that was supposed to span 500, 600 years of Native history. And I didn't know it all well, and it was ongoing too. It wasn't as though it was something that was back there where I could just reach and pull it whole and put it in the book. It was something that was continuing on, and it was changing all the time. So that's not an excuse. That's the reason I did it.
Please join me in thanking